Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Man of Steel, the newest Superman movie. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance. I have a bit of a cold, so hopefully I don't sound too iffy. I tried filming this yesterday when it was worse, and it just came across as really bizarre. So yeah, let's quickly get into Man of Steel. Now, reviews have been all over the place for this movie. Some people love it, some people hate it, but for the most part it seems like the majority of viewers are in the middle. They're unenthusiastic either way. And what do I feel? Well, I had a very similar reaction to Iron Man 3, although for different reasons. Now, if you've seen that video or read my review, you should know that Iron Man 3 really disappointed me, and Man of Steel did too. That's not to say that Man of Steel is a bad movie. I thought overall it was okay. In fact, I actually probably would even go so far to say it was just really uneven, and I'm also going to have to warn you that I might seem like I'm nitpicking this, but I want to stress that every flaw I point out meant a lot to me. It might not mean anything to you, so you just have to really consider what I'm saying and decide yourself how that relates to you. So first off, it's very obvious that even though Zack Snyder is directing this, he's doing his best Christopher Nolan impersonation. Big fucking mistake. Christopher Nolan really did help revive the comic book movie genre with Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. And I really loved The Dark Knight, and I even liked Batman Begins and The Dark Knight Rises. But that kind of setting, which is grittier and more grounded in reality, works really well for Batman. You don't have to change too much to make that happen. But Superman, it's just not the same. Now, when the first Superman movie was, I believe, in the late 70s, with Christopher Reeves, and it was directed by Richard Donner, and that was really the perfect time to make a Superman movie, because that was when the summer blockbuster was really coming into stride, so a lot of money was getting put into these kinds of projects, so it had a lot of resources to work with. But also back then you could make a campier, sillier, more light-hearted movie. But the trends have changed since then. Now people want darker and edgier, and so they tried to put Superman in that kind of setting, and it just didn't work for me. Superman himself is too rooted in camp. Just the outfit alone is very, very cheesy. But it's Superman, and we love him for it. But think about it. When you were a kid, back before you knew what politically correct was, who didn't make gay jokes regarding the character? It never diminished my entertainment of him, at least. I always thought Superman was cool. But it was definitely the fruitiest looking suit I've ever seen. And, his mannerisms, how he'd rip his shirt and revealing the S, and just the over-the-topness of that world. It's just designed for camp, so you can't just bring that into the Christopher Nolan-esque setting and expect it to work. Now, they do tone down, his mannerisms, his suit. They make him more of a troubled and edgier character, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. But even the suit, you just can't. It's still corny. It's still cheesy. You could tone it down, but that's going to stop it from being at least somewhat flamboyant. Now, you could, of course, change it like I know what the X-Men movies did, but, if they did that, it just wouldn't be Superman. The silliness is just part of that world. So that was one issue I had. That was actually my main concern, because Man of Steel, whether you like it or not, it is being too trendy. It is catering to what the audiences are into these days, and I just think that was a mistake. They should have either just... It should have made its own... it should have gone down its own path instead of just trying to imitate the Batman movies. So now let's get into the content of the script itself. The film opens with an extended sequence where Krypton is destroyed. It focuses mainly on Russell Crowe's character and Michael Sheen's character, Zod. And that was pretty exciting, but I also felt it maybe went a bit too long. And it got to a point where, honestly, I started thinking that story was more interesting than the main story, so I almost wanted more of that, while at the same time it probably should have had less of that. I know it's kind of a weird dilemma, but what can you do? But then it immediately cuts to Superman as an adult, and he's very troubled. He's kind of solemn, even though he has a heroic streak in him. He is kind of petty at times, and then he'll see something that will remind him of his childhood. So he'll flash back to where he was a kid, where he'd be picked on, and it's showing how he became this way. I think that was a big mistake too. The flashbacks, for one, they're very redundant. It seemed like all of them were the same thing. You know, he's being bullied, he's having trouble fitting in, and Kevin Costner or his wife, shoot, I can't think of the actress's name right now, and I feel really embarrassed about that because she was a pretty big star. But they'll have some speech that will cheer him up. Well, for one, these speeches were all very similar, so it just got old fast. But also, whenever the present events would actually get interesting, they would cut to a flashback throughout the entire movie, and it just took me out of the story. I think really they should have, you know, as soon as Krypton was destroyed, cut to when he was a kid, replace half of those scenes with more original content, and they would have been much more compelling, so then we could see how Superman became the way he was, where he is, you know, much more troubled and stuff like that. Instead, it just feels odd that they do that, because once Superman finds, you know, the ship where he discovers who he is, he dons the outfit and becomes, you know, classic Superman. When that arc really didn't make any sense to me. It should have been, you know, kid stuff, showing him going through all these problems as an adult. You know, he could easily go on the wrong path if he chooses to, but he's fighting those urges, and then he finally realizes his calling. But there needed to be a bridge between, you know, Superman, kind of the petty jerk, to the hero. Instead, it's just, you know, he's troubled, and then he suddenly becomes a hero out of nowhere, and that's mixed in with some flashbacks regarding his childhood that stop really meaning anything after the third or fourth one. So it was just a big mess in terms of its narrative. I feel the writer, David Goyer, who really isn't that good of a writer, he's done some decent stuff, but he's also made some really bad movies too. I just felt this project was a bit too ambitious for him, that he tried to do something epic, but he just really fumbled with the narrative, and it just kind of collapsed under its own weight. It is incredibly repetitive, it seemed like, and this movie goes over like 2.5 hours, so this is a long running time, and you need lots of content to keep us from being bored. But there's like this scene where he meets Russell Crowe's character, his father, for the first time, and Russell Crowe pretty much explains everything that happened that we saw in the first 20 minutes. And this takes a couple minutes itself too, or at least it felt like. And I kept wondering, why did they need that? We know all of this from what we saw. And you know, they could have easily wrote around it, you know, where he starts maybe telling the story, then it fades out and fades back in, and he's finishing the story. It just seemed like unnecessary padding, and for a movie that's that long, you don't need padding, damn it. Let me see, I gotta look at my notes. So that really hurt the pacing, and that's a big problem for a comic book movie, because any film like this that relies on spectacle to this degree, it needs to have a real strong pace, so you're never bored. But I will admit, sometimes I started getting a little tired. It became kind of lethargic. So they could have cut so much out. Alright, what's next? Oh yeah, there's a lot of unnecessary characters. I'm not familiar with the comics, so I'm sure they all have a purpose in future movies, but it seems like it's taking for granted that there is going to be a sequel, so they introduce a bunch of people who probably will be important then, but aren't important now, and I do not like it when movies rely so much on that. Like, that was one of my big issues with Iron Man 2. It seemed like so much of that movie was just leading up to the Avengers, when honestly, you know, I really want to see the Avengers, but I'm more interested in the current story, so I didn't really understand why they had Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White, and, you know, okay, he has a few scenes that are relevant involving Lois Lane, but then, like, he'll keep showing up during the last half just running. Kind of pointless to include that character. Or what about that fat kid who bullied him as a kid, Superman as a kid, but then he kind of changed his ways and became nicer? Well, they keep showing him during the second half, but there isn't really any payoff to that. So that was odd, and there are a lot of other supporting characters too. I actually did like most of them, but they weren't really necessary to the storyline. So, but the biggest problem I had was with Lois Lane. Now, I do like how they incorporate her into the plot more, but her interactions with Superman himself are just very stale. In the original movie, they had that dilemma where Clark Kent was in love with her, but she didn't even notice he exists because she was madly in love with Superman, not realizing that they were the same person. And that made for a lot of interesting interactions. Well, here she pretty much figures out who Clark Kent is from the beginning, and they don't have a lot of screen time together. They have a few moments where, yeah, they exchange information, but for the most part, they're going their own ways, even though he has to save her a few times, and then at the end, they kiss, and it's like, there was no build-up to this. It just kind of felt awkward, and considering how important Lois Lane is in the legend of Superman. I mean, even I know who she is even before I watched the movies, because she is in so many ways just as important as Superman in the comics, because she's the one who always gets rescued. So I was a little disappointed that there wasn't really much between them there. What's next? It tries too hard to be deep, I felt, and this is another Nolan trait. There's a lot of characters, like especially Kevin Costner and Russell Crowe, they're constantly delivering speeches. And while the speeches are well written, they're also a little overwritten. And it doesn't help that half of the time they're just repeating speeches that they gave earlier in the film, but it just seems like the writer was trying too hard to be moving and inspiring, even though sometimes it really did work. And I will actually say this, I thought the cast did very well, and this is even more impressive when you consider a lot of these guys could have just slummed it and sleepwalked through the role, like Russell Crowe and Kevin Costner and Lawrence Fishburne. They aren't main characters, at least compared to the actual main characters, but I did feel that they were giving their all, and they added a touch of class to the movie, especially with Russell Crowe. I really liked how he portrayed I can't think of the character's name, but Superman's father. And it's always nice to see Kevin Costner in a big movie again, because I really do think he's a good actor who just made some really bad career decisions and was reduced to making crappy movies, almost direct-to-DVD movies now, even though he occasionally will have something respectable pop up again. But yeah, I thought the cast did good. I'm not really sure about Henry Cavill as Superman. I thought he did fine, but I don't know, I just didn't like how the character was portrayed, and it didn't just ever feel like Superman to me. I know this is going to piss some people off, but I thought Brandon Routh made a better Superman. It was just more of what I thought about the character, but I can't really blame Henry Cavill because Zack Snyder clearly had a different vision for that character, but it just wasn't as interesting to me. Of course, neither of them were as good as Christopher Reeves, but what can you expect? As for, I can't think of her name, I believe she was in Enchanted and Wedding Crashers. She plays Lois Lane, and yeah, once again, she did fine. The character wasn't that interesting, but I did think that she was more compelling than Kate Beckinsale in that same role from Superman Returns. Still not as good as Margaret Kidder, though. So, she did fine, though. No problems there. Okay, so let's get into the action and the special effects. Honestly, throughout the first half, I was disappointed. The action scenes, there weren't many, but they were kind of underwhelming me, and the special effects, they ranged from good to they looked too much like special effects. Now, we all know that in order to create these sequences, you're going to be using a lot of green screen work, a lot of CGI, whatever. But here it looked too much like CGI, or like they're in front of a green screen. If the special effects are good enough, you're just not going to be thinking about that. But luckily, there is a reason for this. You see, it appears that Zack Snyder put all of his resources into the finale, the third act. And even though I say that, usually the third act is like 30 minutes long, this is more like the last 50 minutes to maybe even an hour. When Zod invades Earth, it is freaking phenomenal. The special effects become incredibly realistic. The action scenes are very high octane and ambitious. There were some problems, like I was hoping that the action would resemble 300 or Watchmen, where there's a good balance of speeding up the camera to slowing it down using a lot of slow motion, but always focusing more on the choreography. Here, though, it's more like Sucker Punch, where everything is so fast-paced that it's really hard to keep up with it. It's hard to tell what was going on at times, but still, at least it never became completely incomprehensible like Sucker Punch started to do during the second half of that movie. And it was still, I thought, always very exciting when the action was happening. I loved watching Zod and Superman clash. One thing I always drove me insane about the other movies is Superman never really had a rival, somebody who could actually overpower him. I think Superman 4 did, but it was just so badly handled that you didn't really care. But, even in Superman 2, where Zod also made an appearance, it took Zod and his two henchmen to overpower Superman, who you got the impression would easily crush these guys in a one-on-one fight. But not here. Superman fights Zod, who's pretty much his equal, maybe even his superior, as well as all these other villains who are also around his level. So it made the fights that much more engaging. And I gotta give Man of Steel credit. This is the only time where Superman really felt vulnerable. Superman 2 did actually have some of that, but I'm talking while he has his powers. One of the big issues in Superman 2 was that he willingly gave up his powers, and that's what made him vulnerable. But here, he gets his ass kicked a few times, and that I thought really was worth it, because you just don't see Superman get his ass kicked that often. What else can I say? Actually, my favorite parts in terms of the action was when one of the bad guys would take on the normal humans. Just, you could see the difference in speed and power. I just liked the difference. To me, that was in a lot of ways more interesting than watching, two Supermen clashing and being at equal speed, but moving so fast that it was kind of hard to follow what was going on. So that was just my personal preference. And that's really all I have to say. I will admit too that the finale had some emotion to it. When at one point Lawrence Fishburne's character is in peril, and as well as a few other people, and I really felt that, which says a lot considering they didn't really spend too much time developing anybody. So I had to give Zack Snyder credit there. And I really like Zod, played by Michael Sheen. Michael Sheen's just brilliant. Michael Sheen is one of the few people who can go really over the top and still make it work. Whereas, like just as an example, Kevin Spacey in Superman Returns, he was generally entertaining, but sometimes he'd go too over the top to where it was just a bit hard to take him seriously. But not with Michael Sheen. He can go as over the top as he wants, and he's always kind of menacing and fearsome. But they also made that character kind of sympathetic. He's always the bad guy, but you understand why he's doing what he's doing. It's just not a typical villain motive. So would I recommend Man of Steel? If you want to watch it, I'd say go ahead, but not at full price, because it's not bad enough to dissuade you from giving it a look. If you had no real interest in seeing it, then don't, because it's not good enough to change your mind either. As a whole, I'd say Star Trek Into Darkness was a lot better. Fast and the Furious 6 might have been more stupid, but it knew what it was a lot more, and I thought it worked better as entertainment than Man of Steel is, whereas Man of Steel had a higher reach. It wanted to be a great movie and just fell short. But I would at least give it a higher rating than Hangover 3, Internship. I'd say Iron Man 3 is a little bit better, but it was also more disappointing, if that made sense. So yeah, that's just what I feel. If you want to know what I think about the other Superman films, I really like the first one, primarily because the special effects never overstepped their bounds. They were top of the line for the time, but they only did what they could accomplish without looking real phony in retrospect. So it's aged pretty well, and the characters were a lot of fun in their roles. I loved watching Gene Hackman, Christopher Reeves, and Margaret Kidder interact. Superman 2 was a very flawed sequel, but it had its great moments mixed in with some really bad moments. That's due to some behind-the-scene drama where two directors had different visions of where to take it. Superman 3 and 4 sucked. Superman 4 was just really incompetent on every level, whereas Superman 3 was just annoying because it tried too hard to be funny, and it squandered some really good ideas. Superman Returns, I actually felt that was more of a Superman movie than Man of Steel. It got the tone right. It was just really underwhelming. The only exciting action set piece was the plane sequence, and everything else was kind of a letdown. I'd say it was, in some ways, a more evened out Superman film than Man of Steel was. It wasn't as uneven, but Man of Steel also had more high points. So I'd say it's more comparable to Superman 2. Maybe not quite as good, but close. So that's all I have. Yes, there will be a Critiquing the Critics episode out this week. I had the script completely finished. As long as I get better, that shouldn't be a problem. I did written reviews of Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, a comedy horror film, and Lake Placid, also a comedy horror film about a killer crocodile. So check those out and be sure to follow me on Twitter. That is all I have. I'll see you guys later.